A hush descends. Welcome to all of you. Good evening. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for coming. I'm David Calhoun, Professor of Philosophy here at Gonzaga University and Director of the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute, the sponsor and organizer of the Faith, Film, and Philosophy 2024 series, of which this evening's talk is a part. The Institute was formally brought into being in 2002, though activities by predecessor organizations stretch back another 5 years into the late 1990s. The Institute has promoted events across a range of topics, though all in some way address the complementarity of faith and reason as they are articulated in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Dimensions of faith-reason integration addressed by the Institute include faith and science, the problem of evil and suffering in a world created by a good and powerful God, and philosophical reflection on the existence and nature of God. A further area of topical focus for the Institute is the cultural and social impact of Christianity, both as a source of ideas found in popular culture and as a framework for critically evaluating popular culture. The Faith, Film, and Philosophy series is the most important manifestation of this final thematic focus. For a number of years now, the Institute has supported scholarly examination of film as it raises spiritual issues and reflects cultural assumptions. This year, our theme particularly contrasts the spiritual to the phenomenon of secularism by investigating the topic spiritual film themes in a secular age. There is no doubt that Western culture has moved away from a presumption in favor of theism and the religious to move toward vague forms of spirituality and even outright rejection of religion. The question we want to ask is, what space, if any, is there left for religious and spiritual themes in popular film and television shows? Our speaker tonight, and our speaker tomorrow night as well, will address this question. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the friends and donors whose support makes events supported by the Institute possible. The Institute is generously supported by the Father Robert J. Spitzer Society of Jesus Leadership Fund, which was created when Father Robert Spitzer retired as Gonzaga's president in 2009. A great number of friends of Father Spitzer and of Gonzaga University have contributed to this fund over the years. The Institute is deeply grateful for their support and indebted to all of them for the gifts that make events like tonight's talk possible. And while I'm mentioning Father Spitzer, I do want to say Father Spitzer has been gracious in supporting the Institute since he left as president of Gonzaga, and he's been coming for the last couple of springs to speak, and will be here again next spring to speak on the topic of faith, science, and the Bible. So check the Institute's website if you'd like more information about that. I also want to, this is off script, but I want to especially welcome the participants in the Faith, Film, and Philosophy seminar. Faith, Film, and Philosophy consists of two separate tracks of events. One of those is a sequence of public events like this event tonight, this talk, and there have already been 3 such events over the course of this week. A talk that began the week by Professor Brian Clayton on the films of M. Night Shyamalan, and then a screening and panel viewing and discussing the film Barbie on Tuesday night, which was lots of fun. And then last night, a group of student panelists who presented short papers on themes about spirituality in film. So welcome to all of the seminar participants. We're glad that you're here. Oh, I didn't say that's the public track, and then there's also a separate private event where a group of scholars, 14 scholars this year, gathered together and discuss one another's work on faith, film, and philosophy. And so that's happening tomorrow and Saturday. Our speaker tonight is Michael P. Foley, Professor of Patristics in the Honors College of Baylor University. His academic research and writing focuses on the thought of St. Augustine, early and medieval Christianity, liturgy, and comedy and tragedy. Significant scholarly publications in these areas include an edited edition of Augustine's Confessions and a series of translations of Augustine's philosophical dialogues published by Yale University Press. He also regards himself as a, this is his word, dabbler in the area of faith and culture. He has written and spoken on a number of topics in film, including Catholicism in film, mystery films, and the films of Andrew Nichol and Whit Stillman, who we actually had here as a part of Faith Film Philosophy in 2017, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. In addition to Professor Foley's scholarly work, he is also a popular writer and speaker on Catholic history and culture, having produced such works as The Politically Incorrect Guide to Christianity and the Drinking with the Saints series of books. I should mention, we have several of the copies of both Professor Foley's books and the speaker for tomorrow night out on the book table, so I hope you'll take a look at the conclusion of the lecture. I also want to say a special thanks to Professor Foley, who's a friend of mine who taught my kids when they went to Baylor, so that's a delightful thing. But also, he's been such an important contributor to the Faith, Film, and Philosophy series over the years. I had to count them up, but he's been to Faith, Film, and Philosophy already 5 times. This is his 6th time speaking at Faith, Film, and Philosophy. And every talk he offers is a gem. So if you would help me welcome Mike Foley.
Thank you so much. That was really kind of you, Dr. Calhoun. I don't deserve that. But he is indeed a good friend. And a sign of his friendship is that he invited me here tonight and saved me from the weather in Waco, Texas, which is 30 degrees warmer. The fall has not yet come. It has made some of us a wee bit impatient. So it is a delight to be here in Spokane, but also a delight to be here now with such glorious weather and such beautiful foliage. So my talk tonight is a secular stage, and I will explain what I mean by that. As the advertisements for this wonderful seminar made clear, films or series with spiritual themes, such as faith, transcendence, meaning, the sacred, the holy, seem to have fallen on hard times. The days of blockbusters like Bing Crosby's Going My Way, had to mention Bing Crosby here at Gonzaga, or Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, have been replaced by nunsploitation horror flicks like the 2024 Immaculate, starring the buxom yet wooden Sydney Sweeney, and secular films that evince little interest in spiritual transcendence, even films that should have given religion a more central place in their narratives, such as the recent Napoleon and Oppenheimer, failed to do so. It is indeed a problem today, and later I will offer several possible reasons why. But before I do, I would like to suggest that the thorny relationship between divine revelation and the motion picture industry runs deeper than a recent anti-Christian bias in Hollywood or a current shortage of Christian screenwriters, as real as these problems are. I contend the problem is as old as cinema itself. Now, for some authors, the problem has to do with the inherently limited nature of cinema itself. Just a few weeks ago, Crisis Magazine published an article by Professor John Grundelski entitled "The Ever-Present but Anti-Transcendent Screen." The ever-present but anti-transcendent screen. Grundelski primarily has in mind the small screens of our smartphones and is largely concerned, along with Jonathan Haidt, about the effects of small screen culture on our youth and on their mental health. But his arguments can also be applied to the silver screen. He writes, "The culture and ethos of the screen is flat and temporal, very imminent, very now, in some sense, very ephemeral. None of these characteristics is conducive to openness to transcendence. They in fact foster an indifference to, if not alienation from, more transcendent realities. All right, so that is Grondelski's argument that the screen is inherently anti-transcendental. Other authors are a bit more optimistic, at least about film. In a 1955 address to the representatives of the International Union of Cinema Theater Managers and of the International Federation of Film Distributors, Pope Pius XII shared Grondelski's concerns. The cinema, the Pope wrote, being by its nature an art and diversion, ought to remain confined, as it were, to the fringes of human activities, governed, of course, by common laws of common sense. But since, in fact, it has become for the present generation a spiritual and moral problem of enormous importance. This is in 1955, when the highest grossing films included Disney's Lady and the Tramp. Although in fairness, 1955 also included The 7-Year Itch, with the famous scene of Marilyn Monroe's skirt being blown upwards by a subway draft, a scene that ended her marriage to Joe DiMaggio. But despite his concerns, the Holy Father believes that cinema avails itself of the traditional power of dramatic art of all times and in all civilizations, but with a notable advantage over the latter, by the greater freedom of movement, by the spaciousness of the scene, and by the other effects special to the cinema. Even, he writes, a sound film in black and white appears like a magnificent stage performance, combining all the dramatic, visual, musical, and technical arts that man can devise. As much as I respect Marshall McLuhan's mantra that the medium is the message, which is implicit in Grondelski's critique, I still tend to side with Pope Pius XII. Granted, McLuhan has a point. I, for one, would rather watch reruns of The Price is Right than a televised Mass. And that is saying a lot, for I loathe The Price is Right. But for me, as a Catholic, watching a Mass on TV is an utterly fake experience. I would be better off praying the rosary privately with the boob tube off. However, watching the opening scene of the classic 1981 neo-noir crime drama True Confessions, where Robert De Niro plays a priest celebrating a solemn high mass, is quite a different matter. That is art. And art has the capacity to transcend, even art on celluloid. So perhaps the problem is not with film, but with secularism becoming, well, more and more secular. I've entitled my presentation A Secular Age, or stage rather, to play off of Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, a massive tome that, God willing, will never be adapted to film. My intention is twofold: to point out that Hollywood is and always has been a secular stage, and that also its audience in the current theater of life, the people who buy tickets to see a movie, increasingly constitute a secular stage. And my main concern is what a spiritual filmmaker should do in the wake of these two stages. So tonight I propose, first, to provide a rough definition of secularism. Second, to evaluate the average religious movie during the golden age of Hollywood, and then contrast that era with our own. And then third, offer a few thoughts on ways for spiritual filmmakers to work in an environment such as ours. So let's go to the first part, the secular terrain. We could talk about secularism at great length. I will only mention two qualities that seem to me to be relevant to our discussion. The first is that secularism has become synonymous with what Charles Taylor calls exclusive humanism, an anthropocentric ideology that is entirely immanent, concerned with the here and now, and closed to transcendence, that is, contact with the divine or the hereafter. It is, Taylor writes, a purely self-sufficient humanism, accepting no final goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiance to anything else besides human flourishing. Like Christianity, it is concerned with human flourishing. But unlike Christianity, and this is what makes it virtually unprecedented, is the idea that this flourishing involves no relation to anything higher. Living within this immanent frame has a significant impact on one's imagination, which in turn affects one's ability to either appreciate and understand a story or compose one. These are a few examples of my own that came to mind. Whereas a mind exclusively focused on the immanent sees coincidence, a mind open to the transcendent sees providence. Where an immanent mind sees nature as a disenchanted commodity, or perhaps a fragile good threatened by reckless human degradation, the transcendent mind sees nature as a sacramentum, a divine sign that points to God. Where an immanent mind sees misfortune, the transcendent mind sees divine chastisement, or perhaps some other hidden good. Where an immanent mind looks down and equates his own mind with his brain, the transcendent mind looks up and sees his own mind as an image of God. And where the immanent mind sees death as the end or the ultimate evil, the transcendent mind sees it as a new beginning. Another characteristic of secularism, and this is the second characteristic I would mention tonight, is that it is not, as is commonly imagined, a neutral space, but a veritable religion unto itself, something that makes a demand on our ultimate allegiance. Several scholars have written about this topic, but I will mention only two. In his 2011 Migrations of the Holy, God, State, and the Political Meaning of the Church, William Cavanaugh argues that modernity did not so much weaken religious fervor as transfer it from the church to the nation state, boxing in the former and making the latter the object of one's hope, comfort, and meaning. Taken to an extreme, the state then becomes a new and idolatrous religion, complete with its own priesthood and liturgy, and call for ultimate sacrifice in the form of fighting in its wars. Even more interesting, in my opinion, is Leslie Newbigin's 1988 Foolishness to the Greeks, the Gospel and Western Culture. Newbigin left his native England in 1936 to be a Presbyterian missionary in India. And he worked there tirelessly until he returned home in 1974. When he returned home in 1974, he was in for a bit of a surprise. Think of how much England had changed from 1936 to 1974. He had missed everything from the Blitz to the Beatles. This Rip Van Winkle experience led Newbegin to reflect more deeply on the nature of modern Western culture. The sociologist Peter Berger had argued that because religion has a plausibility structure and secular modernity has none, Christians have difficulty taking roots in modernity. Newbegin meets Berger halfway. Christians do indeed have a plausibility structure, as Berger calls it, but so too does modernity. And there is a conflict between the two, precisely because these two structures are not the same. For example, the modern distinction between facts and private beliefs and the privileging of individual autonomy and choice are at odds with the Christian worldview. Newbegin concludes, the result is not, as we once imagined, a secular society. It is a pagan society. And its paganism, having been born out of the rejection of Christianity, is far more resistant to the gospel than the pre-Christian paganism with which cross-cultural missions have been familiar. Here, surely, is the most challenging missionary frontier of our time. The point of Newbegin's book is that modern Christians need to think of modern Western culture as missionary territory. It's not just the far reaches of Africa and Asia that are missionary territory. It's Poughkeepsie, New York. But it's a different kind of paganism, and that presents a particular challenge. Regarding, and this is the second part of my talk, we'll get into American film now. But first, a note on the American experience or experiment with secularism. Our founding fathers came up with a unique solution to the problems that they faced. A secular government presiding over a Christian society. It maddens me when we have these debates about, oh, is America a Christian nation? Well, it depends what you mean by nation. Is a nation defined by its regime or by its society? Because we have a secular government, but the original plan was we would continue to have a Christian society. Whether that's a Christian nation depends on your definition of nation. But on one hand, the federal government is to remain neutral on which religion is the best and not to establish an official religion on the national level. Though interestingly, the United States Constitution does allow states to establish an official religion. I don't think many have. I think there were a couple at the founding, but they went on to disestablish. On the other hand, the consensus of the founding fathers was that Christianity is essential to a healthy democracy, for it produces morally responsible citizens capable of self-governance. As President John Adams put it, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. This belief was a cornerstone of American legal and cultural self-understanding well into the 20th century. Listen to this paragraph from the 1950 Supreme Court decision, Zorak versus Clausen. This is the Supreme Court speaking. We are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being. When the state encourages religious instruction or cooperates with religious authorities by adjusting the schedule of public events to sectarian needs, it follows the best of our traditions. I didn't think it was going to go there. For it then respects the religious nature of our people and accommodates the public service to their spiritual needs. To hold that it may not would be to find in the Constitution a requirement that the government should show a callous indifference to religious groups. That would be tantamount to preferring those who believe in no religion over those who do believe. Holy cow, can you believe this is the Supreme Court? We don't want to be accused of privileging atheists. We are a religious people. But despite this robust endorsement of religious belief, there were two strings attached to the American experiment. The first, as we have already seen, is the privatization of religion, the reduction of religion to one private opinion among many other private opinions. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my bones, Thomas Jefferson declares, if my neighbor believes in one God or 20. And second, there is an anti-Catholic vein with the American experiment. The same John Adams, religious people as essential to constitutionalism, wrote to Jefferson, can a free government possibly exist with the Roman Catholic religion? Adams' opinion was far from novel. In his foundational letter concerning toleration, John Locke states that there are two groups that cannot be part of a modern liberal democracy. Atheists, because, not believing in God, they will commit perjury with impunity and thus undermine the judicial system. And quote, those who bow to a foreign potentate. Papists. I mentioned earlier the Sydney Sweeney movie, Immaculate, but Americans have been liking the nunsploitation genre since at least 1836, when a mentally ill woman wrote The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, or The Hidden Secrets of a Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed, which gave in lurid detail alleged trysts between priests and nuns in a Montreal convent. I mention all this only to point out that if a filmmaker today is Catholic, he or she must face this additional challenge. It's still somehow part of our drinking water. But I also contend that American film has always been affected by this secular situation. Even during the golden age of Hollywood, religious films that do justice to the theme of transcendence without being saccharine are relatively rare. Movies such as Going My Way, or Angels with Dirty Faces, or Boys Town portray the Catholic Church and Catholic priests favorably and are well-told stories. And I imagine that they served the admirable goal of reducing anti-Catholic prejudice. However, it can be argued that these are more PR victories for Irish Catholics than mature explorations of the divine mysteries. It may have been needed, I'm not poo-pooing it, but it's not quite, I think, what we're looking for today. And then movies such as Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments strain the great story of the Hebrew Exodus out of Egypt through the colander of Lockean liberalism. This great cinematic spectacle, complete with scintillating romantic tensions and an odd abundance of male nipples, reflects the American notion of religious liberty and pluralism rather than the biblical notion that freedom is only for the sake of worshiping the one true God, which is the only reason God told Moses to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. It was to worship the one true God in the desert. And if things weren't golden during the golden age, you can imagine what they are like now. Today's society, in my opinion, has three additional complications. The first, these are all fairly obvious, at least the first two, I think. Recent decades have witnessed a sharp decline in religious identity and the rise of the so-called nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E, in American society. Fewer people today identify as Christian, and still fewer practice their faith through things like attending church every Sunday. Second, there has been a sharp decline in religious literacy. Now, these two developments are related, but not identical. For most of the history of the Christian West, everyone had a certain familiarity with the symbols and stories of Christianity, even when they were not believers. And this familiarity created a shared language through which all, believer and unbeliever alike, could communicate. In the 20th century, atheist or agnostic authors could still draw from a rich tradition of biblical literacy in order to articulate their own lack of belief or their own criticisms of religious belief. James Joyce comes to mind, and so does Cormac McCarthy, although some scholars suspect that he was more religious than he said he was. A perusal of David Lowell Jeffrey's Dictionary of Biblical Tradition in English Literature shows the enormous impact that, say, the King James Bible had on civilization as we know it today. It affected the language of our politics, our culture, our literature. What will happen to our culture when this shared lexicon is no longer intelligible? When people no longer know the origins of an eye for an eye? Seems obvious, but someday people won't know it, or the meaning of a mea culpa, or even the meaning of a Hail Mary pass. And how does one tell a Christian story when the symbols and images of Christianity, such as the waters of baptism or the Madonna and Child, become alien? So, sharp decline in religious and biblical literacy. And number 3, there has been a sharp rise in what the sociologists Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning call victimhood culture. The author's thesis is that the embrace of victimology that began in the 1960s and 70s has given rise to a new culture of victimhood. Like any other moral culture, victimhood culture offers a framework for resolving conflict and awarding praise or blame. But in crucial respects, victimhood culture is unlike any other, past or present. Unlike honor cultures, which bestow awards to winners, victimhood cultures bestow awards to victims or losers who have been at the short end of the stick of hegemonic societal influences. On the surface, such an exchange of reward and blame is congenial to Christianity, for it is the Christian narrative that carves a space for the victim, chiefly in the innocent victim that is the person Jesus Christ. But, again, according to Campbell and Manning, under the influence of the New Left, this concern for the victim has turned into an outcry against the very religion that Jesus Christ founded, portraying it as oppressive. This at least is the position of René Girard in his monograph, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. As Girard puts it, the left's new totalitarianism reproaches Christianity for not defending victims with enough ardor. In Christian history, they say they see nothing but persecutions, acts of oppressions, inquisitions. According to Girard, this new totalitarianism presents itself as the liberator of humanity, but in fact it is trying to demonize the one religion that delivers humanity from the darkness. Girard goes so far as to call the left's new victimology a kind of antichrist, for it apes the teachings of Christ while ushering in something quite different. The Antichrist boasts of bringing to human beings the peace and tolerance that Christianity promised but failed to deliver. But actually, what the radicalization of contemporary victimology produces is a return to all sorts of pagan practices: abortion, euthanasia, sexual undifferentiation, Roman circus games galore, but without real victims, and so forth. Ironically, despite its debt to Christianity, victimhood culture is therefore likely to view Christian films and filmmakers with deep suspicion. So that's depressing. So let's move to the third part. Ways forward. Where does all this leave the filmmaker who wants to depict transcendence? I see at least three possibilities. The first is to play outside the box. That is to say, to circumvent the conventional ways in which a film or series is made. Two examples come to mind: Mel Gibson's 2004 The Passion of the Christ and the GoFundMe juggernaut The Chosen are both outstanding examples of this option. I find The Passion especially interesting. Not only did Gibson break all the rules for making and funding and distributing a Hollywood movie, but the movie itself ignores the usual structure of a Hollywood production. Because usually, despite the fact that Hollywood likes to be avant-garde and push the envelope, Hollywood tends to be, structurally speaking, rather conservative. A typical Hollywood film always has or follows the pattern of a three-act play. And this comes straight out of Aristotle's Poetics. Act 1 is you're introduced to the characters, and Act 1 will include an inciting incident that begins to drive the plot. Some kind of crisis has begun. Act 2 is the crisis building momentum and reaches its zenith. And then Act 3 is the resolution of the crisis. And then usually each of these acts takes up about the same amount of time in terms of the length of the movie. In The Passion, however, we are plunged into Act 2 from the opening scene, which takes up 90% of the movie. Act 3, the resurrection, takes place at the very end, lasts, 30 seconds? And if there is an Act 1, it is only through brief flashback scenes interspersed throughout Act 2. This is very unusual. He broke all the standard rules for making a Hollywood movie. And yet, this unconventional approach became the highest grossing independent film of all time. And it was the highest grossing R-rated film in the United States from 2004 until 2 months ago, when it was surpassed by Deadpool and Wolverine. So, all right, number one, you can play outside the box. It has been done, it can be done. Number two, you can play inside the box directly, yet artfully. The two examples that come to my mind are of Gods and Men, a French production, the true story of Trappist monks in Algeria who must decide between the impoverished community they serve and death by fundamentalist terrorists. It is an absolutely riveting, outstanding movie, and you don't need to be a believer to be drawn in by the power of the story and by the power of the cinematographer. For example, there's no soundtrack. So each scene is just the intensity of the dialogue. In a sense, your emotions aren't being manipulated by ancillary music, right? You feel like you are immersed in the decision of the Trappist community without a sort of creative distance that a soundtrack can create. So that is a successful movie. And it was successful both commercially and critically. It didn't beat out Deadpool and Wolverine, but it still was considered a commercial success. And of course, a more recent example is Terrence Malick's The Hidden Life, which I was told, and I didn't recognize it, is this poster that is from a scene of The Hidden Life. It's another true story. Blessed Jägerstatter? Anyway, a German, a conscientious objector during World War II who refused to fight in the armies of the Third Reich and was executed and has now been recognized as a martyr in the Catholic Church. I think he currently has the rank of blessed and will most likely be canonized as saint. Both of these are, I would consider, success stories of Christian storytelling. And I think they succeeded because they told the story well. That is to say, sometimes it's really hard to make a true story actually sound good. Because you want to be faithful to the details, but then that can kind of bog it down. But these are true stories. They captured the essence of each story. They told it truthfully, but they told it artfully. So to paraphrase a famous line from the big screen, if you tell a story well, they will come. Third and finally, you can play inside the box more indirectly and more playfully. Again, I think of two examples, the films of Whit Stillman, whom we mentioned earlier, and the Coen brothers' Hail Caesar. All of Stillman's films have Christian motifs that point to classical virtue and religious faith, but the motifs are often hidden in layers of irony and humor. His first film, Metropolitan, consists of witty conversations about God, tradition, Jane Austen, and detachable collars. His second film, Barcelona, has a hilarious scene involving dancing while reading the Old Testament. Third film, Last Days of Disco, includes a subplot about faith as a possible counterweight to mental illness. The fourth film, Last Days of Disco, includes the last film, Damsels in Distress. In Damsels in Distress, Lily, one of the characters, after learning that the Catholic Church launched a crusade in the Middle Ages against a group called the Cathars, says in her inimitable voice, "Oh my God, the Catholic Church is like, oh, it's bad." But Lily later learns the hard way that Catholic sexual ethics would have guarded her dignity far more than those of the Cathars as practiced by her boyfriend. So there's a lot of irony in the films of Whit Stillman that essentially lead us to reconsider some of our contemporary prejudices, but in a very gentle, winsome way. The Coen brothers' Hail Caesar is also layered in irony and humor. The movie follows the making of a movie about Jesus Christ during Hollywood's golden age. So there's a whole sort of play within a play thing going on. And it pokes fun at the Hollywood studio system making such a film, as well as the alleged silliness of religious belief. There is one scene that almost sounds like the beginning of a joke, where a Catholic priest, a Presbyterian minister, an Orthodox bishop, and a Jewish rabbi argue theology in front of the brass tacks studio fixer Eddie Mannix. But as it turns out, theology is no more absurd than communism, which we learn later is equally difficult to explain and far more pernicious. Better then to cling in sincerity to the faith, as does Eddie Mannix, where he begins each day going to confession. Hail Caesar also playfully addresses the difficulty of film conveying the transcendent. "Squint! Squint against the grandeur," barks the director to Baird Whitlock, played by George Clooney, as the cameras roll. But the joke is that we only see Baird squinting. The grandeur is off stage. And the movie ends with the disclaimer, "This motion picture contains no visual depiction of the Godhead." a playful parody of PETA's Bill of Health regarding animal treatment during filming. After noting that Cohen is actually Hebrew for priest, one critic writes that the Cohens have always been priestly filmmakers making theology-obsessed films. But hitherto, Satan has been more visible than God in their movies. Almost all their films have a devil figure who relentlessly destroys goodness. Leonard Smalls in Raising Arizona, Charlie Meadows in Barton Fink, Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. Hail Caesar is a refreshing departure from this pattern in which the invisible Godhead is more palpable than the devil. I mentioned 3 possible ways to engage a secular audience, and there are no doubt many more. But I want at the very least to suggest that despite a growing bias in Hollywood and in secular society against so-called organized religion, at least of the Judeo-Christian variety, religious filmmakers should take heart. Christians in particular are participants in what Chesterton calls the thrilling romance of orthodoxy. For Chesterton, orthodoxy accounts for the self-renewing energies of the West, precisely because it insists on the transcendence of God. He writes, by insisting specially on the immanence of God, we get introspection, self-isolation, quietism, social indifference. By insisting specially on the transcendence of God, we get wonder, curiosity, moral and political adventure, righteous indignation. Insisting that God is inside man, man is always inside himself. By insisting that God transcends man, man has transcended himself. Even in our secular age, there remains in every human heart a desire to transcend oneself. And the advantage of the Christian storyteller is that he knows the secret to that transcendence. The story of the Christ is the greatest story ever told, and it has generated countless other great stories as well. From the true lives of the saints to the exhilarating myths and allegories of Tolkien and Lewis, to the deliciously dark parodies of Evelyn Waugh, and the jarring fiction of Flannery O'Connor. Christianity has done so, and it can do so again, even in an age such as ours. Thank you.
Michael, would you take some questions from the audience, please?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the talk. Earlier on, you had mentioned this idea that people who are becoming more and more secular as a culture were losing this idea of understanding the symbols and these kind of things of religion. And I'm curious, at the end there you mentioned like Tolkien and Lewis, and I'm wondering how much you think, even if there's a very secular culture, it doesn't quite understand their church and they understand baptism and these like very like concrete symbols, how much something just like the hero's journey or like the self-sacrifice of Lord of the Rings or the person, you know, who sacrificed themselves comes back as a wise mentor, these sorts of things that seem very popular. I mean, Star Wars, I'm thinking Lord of the Rings, but it seems like Lord of the Rings clearly has a very Christian bent, but it seems like those may fly under the radar, so to speak, a little bit, and I'm wondering if you think that even in a secular age, they would remain popular because somehow built in or humans somehow recognize this story of transcendence and redemption and the meaning of life, or if you think it's only because we know what these symbols are that we're able to pick up on it.
The short answer is, I don't know. So next question. But you bring up a great point, and Tolkien remains popular even if I think a lot of his Christian symbolism isn't picked up on by so-called unchurched audience. Like for example, his Eucharistic allusions. I mean, he peppers certain kinds of allusions to nourishing bread all over the place. But if you're not familiar with the theology of the Eucharist, that may fly under the radar. I guess all I can say is that Tolkien remains popular because he is a great storyteller. And not to add yet another definition of human being to the long list that's already been defined, but one way to think about it is man is the narrative animal. Like there is a way in which our minds are hardwired for stories. One interesting statistic I heard the other day is that if I just gave you a laundry list of facts, please remember these 10 things. But then, so that's one thing. And then on the other hand, I have the same 10 facts, but I embed them in a story. You are 28 times more likely to remember the facts when they're embedded in a story. Now, how did it come up like 28 times and not 27 or 28? I won't question the social science because it's to my advantage to use the statistic. But still, I mean, I believe it, right? That somehow, of course, we're designed to hear stories. We're designed to appreciate them. So if there is a good story, that it will capture our hearts. But yeah, then what to do with the symbolism? I just worry personally about the decline of literacy. When I taught at Notre Dame, they have their architecture students, I think, spend their junior year in Rome, like one semester. So one of my architect colleagues went with them. And they're going through the streets of Rome. So these are Notre Dame architect students. And they asked my colleague, what's with all the pictures on like every other corner of a woman and a baby? Freaking Notre Dame students. Whoa! So that's when I start to worry about the future of our civilization. Yes, ma'am.
So you talked about like how in today's society there's a decline in religion and religious literacy and then a rise in victimhood culture. Do you think the decline in religion and the rise in victimhood culture are related, or is like a cause and effect to the two?
Gosh, I don't know, but it's a great question. It could be that one created a vacuum, like there's already a decline in religiosity, and that this just kind of filled the void. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
I think there's times where like when we don't have answers, we have to go to something, and if it's not God, it has to be something else.
I couldn't have said it better. Yeah. Yes, sir.
This is sort of a similar question. So Gerard says the foundation of that victim ethic is Christ, is the passion. In secularism, they embrace the victim ethic. Why do you think secularism was so resistant to that movie? I never thought the way you said it. It's 2 hours of a man being victimized. Yeah. How do you account for that? So that's the origin of that morality. But secularism hated that movie so much. What do you think about that? How do you account for that?
Yeah, I don't know. So that The Passion was obviously a very controversial film. The amount of violence, it was, what was it called? It was some kind of like violent porn or porn violence, excuse me. Yeah. And then of course it was accused of being anti-Semitic. I think a Girardian explanation would be that in order for victimhood culture to work, you kind of have to steal the concept of victimhood, which you learned from Christ, but steal it and repackage it so that it doesn't lead you back to Christ. Yeah. Because in Christianity, there's only one victim. It's Jesus Christ. And in victimhood culture, everyone's a victim. Or in a weird way, everyone aspires to be a victim. Now, by saying that, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there are no such thing as victims in our society. Of course there are systemic injustices, of course there are oppressors. But what I'm worried about is that concern for justice being manipulated into an unjust ideology. Yes?
So kind of connecting to like modern day, where it comes to like the movies in Hollywood, so can we like have a good movie that uses like religious literacy? You can still use like humor and irony, but to really show that it is like a religious literacy movie, it's like it has a story in it, and it like it has like the story and like the essence is leading it to confirm that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if I completely understand your question, but you're right that one way to do it is through, humor, irony, being very, very indirect, in such a way that it gently invites the members of the audience to re-examine some of their own prejudices against Christianity or the transcendent. But there are other ways to do it. I was actually thinking of adding a fourth one. It says it play inside the box playfully. I was tempted to add play inside the box violently, because Flannery O'Connor plays inside the box violently, right? There's nothing winsome and light and ironic about Flannery O'Connor. She just hits you hard with a hammer, but it does bespeak the transcendent. So there are different ways to do it. Yes?
In a society that's becoming more and more polarized, do you think the traditional view of the Catholic Church versus the more modern day society clashes in a way that people are afraid of maybe the victimhood society that you touched on, or just afraid of receiving backlash for including more conservative candidates?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned like polarized, right? And then you used the C word, right? Conservative. It's interesting, I mentioned this anti-Catholic vein. There was anti-Catholicism, say, 70 years ago, but not because Catholics were conservative. Because 70 years ago, the one thing that Catholic, Protestant, and Jew in America could agree on was a basic moral consensus. There really weren't huge moral controversies 70 years ago. There may have been political controversies. Do we want a big government? Do we want a limited government? Do we want an interventionist foreign policy? Do we want an isolationist foreign policy? Do we like unions? Do we not like unions? But in terms of like, basic morality, there was consensus. And now, of course, there isn't. So in a weird way, the accusations against Catholicism have definitely changed over the decades. What's remained consistent is that there are always accusations against Catholics in the United States. So I guess all I would say is the first step to a proper solution is a proper diagnosis. So if we are Catholic filmmakers, we need to be aware of the situation and then find engaging ways to try to overcome some of those suspicions and hurdles. Yes?
Funny enough, Professor, I'm a public high school teacher, and I'm making my juniors read Flannery O'Connor right now.
Excellent.
2 whole weeks of her and nothing but her. My question for you
have like
is...
a hotline to help them?
Yeah, no, we're doing good work here.
All right.
The question I have for you is, for students who come from an entirely secular family background, and that may be all they know, what do we think is more effective for opening people's eyes, hearts to a different view of reality? Something that is more soft, like showing Life of Pi, for example, or me making them read The Enduring Chill, which we're doing on Monday. What do you think?
I don't know, because it really depends on the person, right? Like, there are some people that maybe need a good electric shock treatment that Flannery O'Connor can give. There are others that may be drawn through more gentle modes of beauty. One thing I should have talked about in the talk is the role that beauty can play in evangelizing, right? The Hidden Life and the films of Whit Stillman are beautiful. They really are visually and in every other way beautiful films. And that too helps sort of draw the audience in. So yeah, gentle beauty or harsh beauty. Both can be paths to evangelization. Yes?
Thank you. So for me, the most spiritually moving film that I've ever seen is Malik's Tree of Life.
Oh yeah, sure.
Like if I'm feeling like really dark about the world, I'll just watch Tree of Life and
Yeah.
And I've recommended that movie to a lot of my Christian friends, and they can't sit through it. So like half hour later, they're like, "Oh God, this is boring. Whatever. I don't even know what you're talking about." And in response, they tell me I should watch God's Not Dead.
Oh.
So I did. And I'm pretty sure that if like I had a blood pressure machine tied to me, it would have gone up. But those seem to be the movies that are being churned out by Christians in Hollywood. And it doesn't seem to me to be doing Christianity any favors.
Amen,
It's just
sister.
kind of like talking. The only people that are gonna like this movie are the people that already accept this particular view of Christianity.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering not just me, but how to make the audience more receptive to something like Tree of Life as a good representation of spirituality and not like God's Not Dead.
Yeah. In some respects, I think you need to have like a side conversation to get them acclimated to what good art should be
Yeah.
before returning them to this particular question. Because you may not win the battle on that, because they like how direct the one movie is, even if it's poorly done, versus the veiled one, which is beautifully done, but like they don't get, why are there dinosaurs there? You know, so yeah, I totally get it. I mentioned the golden age of Hollywood and some of the ways in which it fell short. Out of charity, I did mention some of the more modern Christian films. And you mentioned one of them. And what was the one about the fireman that came out with? Fireproof
Yeah.
was another one. So all right, here I'm just going to be completely politically incorrect. One of the weaknesses of evangelical Protestants doing film is that they break the rule, which is show, don't tell. Right? They just talk the damn subject to death. And the film is about showing, not telling, right? Catholic filmmakers, on the other hand, have a difficulty telling a story without it being saccharine. So there was a movie about St. Therese the Little Flower that came out about 15 years ago, and it was sappy. And it too actually has too much of the telling, not the show. So Christian filmmakers need to bone up and hone their skills. And I'll tell you, there's a phrase among screenwriters. Good screenwriting, good screenplays are what they call off the nose. If something is on the nose, then it's bad art. On the nose is you want to convey this, and you use explicit words to convey it. Better art is oblique. Ovid says, ars latet arte. Art hides its artifice. So to give you one classic example, you may remember the old rom-com When Harry Met Sally with Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan. At the very end, after this tumultuous affair, he confesses his love to her. And she says, oh, Harry, I hate you. I really, really hate you. And then they embrace. So she says, I hate you, but she loves him, right? That's good writing, that's off the nose. If she said, oh, I love you, it'd be sappy and saccharine, and you'd be Ralphing. So, sorry. So Christian filmmakers, and Terrence Malick gets this, need to be off the nose.
Thank you.
Yes.
You alluded to a Supreme Court case, I think the second part.
Yeah.
Can you repeat what that was named and maybe briefly explain the matter being decided?
So it was Zorach versus Clausen, Z-O-R-A-C-H, and then Clausen was C-L-A-U-S-O-N. And a public school was adjusting its schedule so that some of its students could attend a religious event. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's brilliant.
Thank you.
Yes, and then yes.
So, I'm wondering, how is it that we can have different forms of Christian and sacred art with like painting, music, etc. But with movies, there's rejection of that, and because of the I'm wondering, is there just like a quality within a film that that mainstream Hollywood just refuses to lead into? Because there is an audience for these types of movies. You mentioned The Passion that shows that even movies from the Kendrick brothers. So I'm wondering about that.
No, well, the answer I have heard is that there simply is a prejudice against Christian film. There's an anti-Christian impetus among Hollywood actors and the Hollywood elite. That's the short answer. And then, of course, you mentioned other kinds of art. One interesting thing about the cinematic art is the way in which it's tied into economics and profit, which is, as it should be, right? But like the economics by which Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, right? It wasn't like, okay, if I paint The Last Judgment, how many tickets for $1 will we be able to sell, right? So painting sacred art or even composing sacred music happens in a different economic environment. And so somehow that factors into these decisions. In the back and then in the front,
So if a secular person makes a film and they're not intending any sort of transcendence or anything like that, and then a religious person watches it who has the ability to see transcendence, could that film then have a sort of meaning that originally intended?
I definitely believe that. And the reason why I believe that is I believe that with other forms of art as well. I believe that a great artist can write or compose or paint in such a way that the work contains meaning that he himself may have been unaware of. The only example I can think of is someone came up to T.S. Eliot and said, I was wondering, I've got this theory about the four quartets. It seems to me that, and correct me if I'm wrong, you did this, 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 and this for these reasons to create this order. And Eliot looked at him with astonishment and said, I assure you that was not even remotely in the back of my mind. But everything you said is absolutely true. Like your theory totally makes sense of the unity of it. But I wasn't thinking that, right? That's the mark of a great artist. Socrates says when he consulted the poets in Athens, he discovered that anyone could do a better job explaining the poem than the poet, right? That's why there are college professors and poets, right? We explain, they compose, because they can't do both. And then we can't compose, we're idiots. So it's a lovely division of labor. But I believe that can be true of film as well. Yes?
When discussing ways forward, you mentioned the term playing outside the box to convey religion in film. Are there any strategies or techniques that filmmakers and directors can use to best execute playing outside the box?
I don't know the minutia of the film industry. I do know, I mentioned Whit Stillman. Whit Stillman is so Mel Gibson has the highest grossing independent film of all time. Whit Stillman is credited with starting the indie film industry in the United States with his film Metropolitan in 1990. The budget was $20,000. He filmed it in the New York apartments of his friends, one of whom was David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times. Shoestring budget, and then he was nominated for Best Screenplay in the Academy Awards. His first film. He didn't get it, but to be nominated for the $20,000 film, right? And that started the indie film industry. So I guess start cheap, have friends in New York. Yeah, sure. Sorry I can't be of more help. Yeah.
So you kind of, I feel like I didn't hear much when you were talking about like the audience and specifically what kind of crowd pressures are at play with these kind of movies. And I have to, a struggle I'm having is I have to believe that if there was an audience for it, money is so highly valued in the industry that it would get made. I'm curious if you came across any data while you were doing your research for this about audience and the pressures that are going into that.
Yeah, I'll be perfectly honest with you, I didn't. But now I feel inadequate that I didn't. No, it's a great question. It's a question of the marinade. Like, you know, what is the marinade of the American audience? What are we currently steeped in? And then what are we conditioned to respond to? I kept my talk sort of centered on Hollywood and the American experience. But some of the very best films that I've seen that deal with a religious topic are Israeli. And the way they deal with Jewish subjects with honesty and tenderness, but without being saccharine. But I didn't quite know how to bring that in because I don't know enough about Israeli secularism. I suspect it's different than the American experience. So I didn't want to step outside my comfort zone.
Thank you.
Yes.
You said that people, as you mentioned, get become the decline and religious literacy and I'm curious.
Except the students at Gonzaga.
Yeah. Were you supposed to be a motivating factor for young people and actually embrace a shift in religious culture?
Well, I would say one incentive to gain religious literacy, even if you're not a religious person, is just to appreciate the beauty of Western culture more. Like, if you like Toni Morrison, and you should, you need to know something about Christianity. You need to know something about its symbols. You actually need to know something about the Trinity. Because Toni Morrison works out of a lot of really deep theological strains. And so if you like her but don't know any of those, you're going to miss a lot of it. And that's just true of so many of the great works of the West. You know, James Joyce's Ulysses or his Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. If you don't know the same background, I'm teaching Moby Dick to my students right now. If you don't know the Bible, there's just so much of Melville you're going to miss. And it's fun, you know? And the biblical stories are fun. They're engaging. The Bible is great literature. It's not just the Word of God, but God writes well. So I would say beauty and enjoyment. And there should be a certain thrill in being a detective of reality, in being able to read the things around you well and see their deeper significance. And religious literacy can be an aid to that, both with respect to art, but also culture and other aspects of your life. Sure. Yes, in the back.
We should consider like secularism to not be just another example of evolution of film and art. So I mean, for example, you could use jazz. People like jazz in the 40s. Now they like rap. You know, it's a different age. Is it not just the appeal of people instead of the actual secularism itself? I mean, Mel Gibson had his 2016 film Hacksaw Ridge, and that's the example of people. It's still there, but isn't it just like the actual inherent appeal of a World War II movie, or is it the fact that it's not there?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So you're saying is secularism just a sense of changing tastes?
Is it more of the appeal that's like going flat, or is it more of the secularism itself?
Oh, it's like, is the appeal of religious movies going flat? Or is it secularism itself? Yeah. I mean, it could be. So if we are getting saturated with poorly made Christian films, like God Is Not Dead, forgive me, then that can absolutely be a turnoff. But I think it's a both and that we are going to be more critical of those poorly executed films precisely because we have less tolerance in a more secular age, right? So again, the solution is to be better artists as Christians. And I should mention one other distinction. To be better artists as Christians doesn't necessarily mean to hammer home Christian themes all the time. Johnny Cash is famous for saying during an interview, someone called him a Christian artist. And he said, I am not a Christian artist. I am an artist who is Christian. And I think that's a meaningful distinction. So his songs reflect a Christian sensibility, but it's not a direct attempt to evangelize.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, you may.
Mr. Foley.
Since you brought me here.
Your talk has been from the perspective of the angels and speaking to the angels. In other words, you're suggesting here are things that Christian filmmakers can do. I wonder, you might not want to answer this question, but I'll give it a shot anyway. Do you think there are trends in, or even particular films, I'm willing to ask if you think this, particular films that evangelize in a diabolical way for secularism or an anti-Christian worldview? I mean, you mentioned nunsploitation films in a humorous way, but I wonder, do you have some ideas about more serious ways that you see Hollywood or filmmakers in general evangelizing for an anti-Christian outlook?
I do, but I can't think of particular examples off the top of my head. You've caught me off guard.
Okay.
But certainly, you're just going to have to invite me back next year.
Okay. Maybe one more question, if someone has one? Professor Foley, wild into silence.
Okay.
Let's thank our speaker.